Hello everyone, I'm just giving us all a few seconds so we can enter the platform. There we go. Okay, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar from Cambridge, which is all about why the early years matter and the insights that we've got from some recent research. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping to start us off. If you could move the slide along, thank you. To ensure good sound quality, all members of the audience are muted. If you would like to ask questions, please do. You can type them into the questions box, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. It's a little box with a question mark in it, and if you click, you'll be able to type your questions in there. And we will go through the questions at the end of the webinar. So you will receive a certificate of attendance sent to your email inbox from GoToWebinar about an hour after the webinar finishes, and you will receive a copy of the webinar recording sent via email next week. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to quickly hand over to your presenters for today. They are Vincent, our reporting and guidance specialist, and Jellis, our senior research associate. So over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. We'll just do some very quick introductions. So I'm Annie, a former secondary English teacher, now working at Cambridge Insight on teaching and learning, development, reporting, and I am very privileged to have been working on some research with Chris, who I'll let introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Chris. Yeah, I've worked Cambridge Insight for the last 23 years or something ridiculous, and very interested in early years work. Spent most of my time at Cambridge Insight looking at early years stuff. And what we want to present to you today is some stuff that we've done together, a little collaboration that Annie and I have worked on.
Thank you, Chris. As Grace mentioned, we're going to take you through a presentation today, which will last probably around 40 minutes or so. But if you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A box as we go along. I'm going to switch off my camera just to give as much of the screen as possible to the PowerPoint slides, partly because we've got some data to show today, but we'll join you again back at the beginning. At the end, sorry, we're at the beginning. Okay, so I am sure that I'm probably preaching to the converted here when I begin a presentation about why early years matters to early years educators, stressing the importance of the early years. All of us who have been working in education and the early years have long since established an understanding in the education sector of those vital skills and knowledge base that develop in the first few years of life, and the importance of having research-rooted early curriculums that build in lots of time for unstructured, organic play and exploration for our youngest students. But that isn't something that's so clearly understood outside of the sector. I've been around on more than one occasion where eyebrows are raised and there's shocked faces when someone realises that we actually develop curriculums for the early years. People will say, don't they just play? But as these quotes here from the Education Endowment Foundation and also from UNESCO very neatly confirm, the early years is the beginning of it all, really, in terms of education. What happens here can have a significant impact on what happens later, emotionally, socially, and academically. It's just that the academic development at this stage looks a little bit different, where some of us might see a child stacking up cups as simply play. Early years specialists know that that is also the development of early procedural mathematics skills. And where some might see two children just babbling together, early years specialists see the foundations for those early social skills and for reading, because this first 8 years of a child's life sees a significant amount of brain development, and we might think that it's a time to fill it with key knowledge acquisition like we might for older students, but actually that learning journey looks different for a reason. But The significance of these early years and the need to get all children sort of off to the right start also leads to lots of concern for some, especially in light of societal changes. So, for example, there is concern in countries around the world that language acquisition and reading skills are being thwarted by the replacement of books, songs, and oral stories for phone-based games and videos. Indeed, a recent extensive questionnaire conducted by HarperCollins in the USA earlier this year actually raised concerns about the number of baby boys who are rarely or never read to in the first 2 years of their life, just 1 in 5, which was also a contrast to the 44% of baby girls who are read to more frequently. There are concerns that these early habits are leading to a decline in reading for pleasure among adolescents. Only a third of children between the ages of 5 and 10 in this study said they frequently read for pleasure. And this is sort of reinforced by the seeming change in attitude towards reading for pleasure more generally among Gen Z parents, less than 50% of whom in this study considered reading fun. At the end of last year, the European Commission released its employment report on the back of research which indicated that children's maths and reading skills had significantly worsened over the last 12 years across most EU countries. And there was enough that there is concern about the impact of that on the bloc's future ability to power its economy. And at the same time, the OECD raised concerns about the widening gap between the 10% of countries with the lowest levels of numeracy and literacy and the 10% of countries with the highest. And whilst these are just 3 examples of recent research, and there are examples of where the picture isn't quite so bleak, what this kind of research reminds us is that what we do as educators really matters at whatever age we are doing it. So when we're focusing on the early years, that means good quality education in literacy, numeracy, and those social emotional development skills. The right start can set our children on a track to educational success and all the benefits that can offer them as adults. But that does present us with a key question in the early years. How do we know where to start? Children are arriving at their first formal education institution from a range of socio-economic backgrounds and different educational contexts. So they all have very different starting points that educators haven't had any hand in. So this is where a good baseline assessment can help support us to meet our early years children where they are and then plan effectively to take them forward. Chris.
Okay, so go back one.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so where do you start? Well, what we needed was some way of finding out what children actually know and can do when they start in school. And one of the ways you can do that is by using a baseline check. That is a check of prior knowledge before you start teaching them. And about, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago now, myself and a colleague were asked to put together a short assessment for children of 4 years old to find out what they know and what they can do before teachers start teaching them. So we came up with this assessment called Cambridge Check Together, which is designed to be carried out one-to-one with an adult. We don't give a 4-year-old a computer and say, let me know when you finished, because that doesn't work very well. And what it does is it goes through some of the basic skills that you would expect some children to know about when they're about 4 years old. So we're going to ask things like reading, a little bit of maths, a little bit of general vocabulary, that sort of thing. So children coming from a range of starting points and socioeconomic conditions, we can find out what they know. Some children, as Annie said, are read to by their parents. Some children are not. That makes a huge difference to them when they come into school. And then once you've done this assessment, it'll tell teachers exactly what the child knows and can do, and therefore they can plan effectively. So if we can move on, Annie, please. So we developed the Check Together assessment about 3 years ago, and since that time, we've started to get data back. And this is an international assessment. It's designed for international schools. And we started to get some data back, and we thought, well, we ought to do some analysis of this and see what we can find out and see if we can do a little comparison about what's going on. So we ended up writing 2 papers, and you can see their names here: reading skills in the early years in international schools and analysis of early math skills in international schools. And those were both delivered at a conference in Valencia in Spain in March of this year. If you want to read either of those, you can download them from the Cambridge Insight website, or if you go to Google Scholar and just type in Vincent Jellis, they're sort of 3 or 4 down the list, and you'll be able to pick up both of them. So they're there. They're easy to find, and we've designed them to be easy to read. And the actual papers cover some of the data that we got back from a number of international schools. Now, this assessment isn't used that widely yet, but we've got data from 2 schools in Cyprus, a number of schools in India, a number of schools in Indonesia, a couple of schools in Thailand, and 1 school in Vietnam. So you'll see the results from those different schools in the data that we look at later on. So it's a reasonable range of schools from around different parts of the world. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Annie. So this just to summarize what I said before, what's checked together? Well, it's a baseline test used to establish what students know and can do before teaching. It's ideally used at the start of a new school year. And the results you can use to establish information about the cohort as a whole and individual students within it. So you know what individual students know and can do, you know what letters they know, you know what numbers they know, but you can also group children together and say, well, all these children know a few letters, I'll teach them together and plan for those. So the results you can commonly use for lesson planning and curriculum planning. And you can also use it as a follow-up test. And by that, we mean a test at the end of the academic year. We can test them again, and then we can see what progress they've made over the year. And we can see what individual students know and can do over and above what they knew when they came in. And that's extremely valuable to see how effective your teaching is in that early time when you start teaching these new children. So I'd recommend you, if you don't know about this test or you've not used it, worth having a look at. And as I say, all the results will be of this presentation are based on the data that we got from these 2 papers. So over to Annie, and because she wrote the paper on literacy, she's going to talk about literacy first.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. Yep, so as the literacy specialist, I'm going to focus on the results from the reading module of Check Together that we analysed. So it's worth taking a very quick moment to just explain that this reading module in the test assesses the key skills which are required for reading, helpfully illustrated on the screen by the Education Endowment Foundation's Reading House. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with this, the choice of the house imagery here is quite important. The blocks at the bottom, phonological awareness, print knowledge, grammar and syntax, vocabulary, are the foundation skills that need to be learned before you can kind of progress upwards through the other blocks in the house, until you've developed the automaticity, so the ability to automatically read words and comprehend language. Those are the 2 skills that are required for fluent reading. There is interplay between all of these skills at all times. The house isn't trying to imply a linear sequence or any kind of rigid structure, but it does just show us those broad skills that have to be in play for reading comprehension acquisition. So the Check Together test assesses every child's ability in the areas of print awareness. So that's what our test calls concepts about print. That includes some reference to grammar and punctuation as well. It assesses vocabulary, Phonological awareness on that bottom left-hand corner of the reading house, that's what we call letter recognition, word recognition, and then of course phonics as well. Now it is worth noting that the EEF are UK based, so they are focused on the acquisition of reading skills in the English language, and Check Together is also assessing English. Around 50% of words in English can be pronounced sort of accurately by learning our English letter sounds and then blending those to read words. So that's what phonics programs teach. The other 50% of words in the English language need to be learnt by sight, what we call full word recognition, to be able to read them. And again, you have to be exposed to those words a number of times before they can be automatically read by you and kind of transferred into your long-term memory. So in the UK, phonics programs are the chosen method for reading instruction in the early years, alongside high-frequency word recognition teaching. Now, because this assessment is adaptive, there are parts of the assessment that will explore some of these other skills. So, for example, comprehension, but those parts of the test would be accessed by very high-performing children, and potentially also later in the year in the follow-up test that Chris mentioned. It's also really important to note that Check Together is designed to be taken in EY2, so that's by sort of 4, 5, 6-year-olds, some of whom may have had no formal prior education, some of whom will have experienced some formal education instruction through their nurseries or through EY1. And as we've kind of touched on a little bit here, we can't forget the impact of parents. Some of those will have been actively instructing their children in English language acquisition, some will not, and most will be working somewhere along the spectrum between those 2 points. So concepts about print. In this part of the assessment, we're exploring what children understand about print very broadly, and also slightly more technically. So we can see from the graph here that we ask children about what it means to be reading or writing, but we also ask about some other print concepts like what a letter is, what a capital letter is, what a full stop is. And we can see that the awareness of print concepts in terms of what reading is and what writing is generally well understood. But in this sample, it is the children from India, indicated by the sort of lime green bars there, who were able to demonstrate greater confidence, not only in identifying who's reading, who's writing, but in some of those more technical points as well about what a capital letter is, what a sentence is, for example. In the vocabulary section, we assess children's ability to match words with images, testing their acquisition of what we call Tier 1 vocabulary. So just for those who are unfamiliar with the idea of words being tiered or organised into 3 sections, I'll cover this very, very briefly. Tier 1 words are those which we might categorise as being for everyday use. So words like car or lunch or shop. Tier 2 words are high frequency words which are encountered often when reading in very specific contexts. So in a school, they might be words like explain, describe, or analyse. Tier 2 words kind of bridge the gap between Tier 1 words, which we use every day, and then Tier 3, which are topic or field specific words. So hyperbole might be a Tier 3 word that we'd use in English literature, or photosynthesis would be a Tier 3 word from biology. Now, at this very early stage, the Tier 1 words are the most important to utilise and move from a child's short-term memory into their long-term memory. But a reminder that we are assessing the child's English. So if there has been limited English instruction prior to the test, then that is obviously going to affect results. Now, interestingly, vocabulary was the section of the test that students scored most highly in overall. Though again, we can see from these results that the children from India scored consistently highly, whilst children in other regions were more confident with words like car, fruit, house, and box. The children from India are demonstrating confidence with slightly more complicated words like woman, person, passenger. In letter recognition, the child can either say the name of the letter shown on screen, so here, for example, we would say S, or they can offer the sound that the letter might create, so S. Letters are not presented to children alphabetically, but they are presented in the phonics sequence, which is very typical of phonics programs utilised in England. As we noted with the little reading house, phonological awareness, letter effectively awareness, is felt to be more beneficial to learners than the alphabet letter names A, B, C, D, because they better facilitate the sounding out of letter combinations and the sound blending needed to read around 50% of English words. But that isn't always how children are taught English around the world, and so learning the alphabet names may be more dominant in some territories than in others. So the letters that children in this study are were most confident with are broadly in line with the early phonics sounds that are advocated in the English phonics programs. We often refer to those as the SATPIN letters and sounds. They're running along the x-axis here, so you can see S-A-T-P-I-N are the first 6 letters here. However, when we start to look at the confidence of children, when we break the data down by country, we can start to see some interesting patterns emerging. So whilst broadly speaking, student confidence sort of drops off relatively quickly, particularly from students in Cyprus, indicated by the red, and Vietnam in the pink there. And you should note that none of the children from Cyprus reached the later letters in the test. You can see that we stopped here at F. The decline is actually less pronounced for Indonesia in this light green and Thailand in the blue. They kind of stay relatively similar for half of the alphabet letters there. India's recognition levels again remain consistently high. We can see these sort of bright lime green bars, still up here pretty high, above 50% for all 26 letters, even with the more challenging English sounds. So, for example, X, that is actually for children from India, their 6th most confident letter sound, and also Z over here, their 9th most confident letter sound. And those are typically sounds that come later in phonics programs, for example, in the UK. Now, perhaps India's results are unsurprising when we consider that data suggests 49% of children from India are registered in pre-primary education institutions. However, much higher levels of pre-primary education enrolment are also reported in Indonesia and Thailand, 81% and 75% respectively, where students didn't perform quite as well as India in this section. English is less widely spoken in Indonesia and Thailand than in India, though, so that could offer an explanation. But then English is also widely spoken in Cyprus, with a report suggesting 73% of the population there can speak English. And as we noted, the children from Cyprus in this study actually performed least well overall in this section. So I think what we're saying here is that it seems likely that a combination of factors is producing the outcomes in these early sections of the literacy test, reminding us that there are a myriad combination of starting points that each child in an EY class can arrive to us with. The word recognition section is where children hear a word and then must select it from the 5 displayed on screen. You can see an example now. And this is where things, for me, coming from an education system that does use prescribed phonics programs to teach children to read, become really quite interesting. The words for children to identify here are generally 2-letter, so we can see they're at and it, or they're what we call CVC words. So that's a consonant followed by a vowel followed by a consonant, such as sat, tap, pat, and pit, that you can see on screen there on the graph. And they generally incorporate the earlier sounds in those phonic programs I talked about, so those SATPIN letters, S, A, T, P, I, and N. Children were most likely to be confident with the two-letter words, showing that they are able to make a connection between the graphemes, the letters on screen, and the sounds that they heard from their teacher. But as we can see in the graph, it is now the children from Vietnam who emerge as something of an outlier here, those bright pink bars shooting up towards 80%. We can see that in the Vietnam sample, while student confidence with letter recognition, that's shown here on the left-hand side, declines fairly quickly and quite steeply in places, their word recognition confidence, as we can see on the left-hand side, is consistently high. Over 62% of children selected each target word correctly, despite around 50% of them having confidence with just 9 of the 26 letters of the English alphabet. Now, why might that be? Well, while synthetic phonics programs reign supreme in many parts of the Western world, there are other methods for effective reading instruction, and these results perhaps point to a more varied approach here. For example, it could be that the children in this sample, rather than progressing through a full list of letter sounds before tackling sound blending and whole words, have spent more time developing whole word recognition, for example. And then finally, phonics, the most challenging test section for the children in this sample. In this section, the child will see a word on the screen and they will then need to say it out loud to their teacher. So that requires grapheme, the actual shape of the letters, to phonic sound correlation, or it will require strong word recognition, the ability to retrieve a word from the long-term memory. And then, of course, we're expecting children to be able to actually speak these words out loud physically there, and not all children are capable of that at this early stage. So the phonics section in Check Together is only reached if children complete each of the previous test sections, making less than 4 total errors per section, or avoiding 3 errors in a row. In our sample, none of the children from Cyprus or Vietnam made it to this section. So what is interesting and is illuminated in the graph on screen now is that the children from Indonesia had the most success in this section of the test by some way, and that is despite the children having less confidence than their counterparts in both Vietnam and in India in the previous word recognition section of the test, where they were required to identify the written word on screen from a word that was said to them orally. Now, when we look at the words in this assessment, running along that bottom axis there, we can see that Indonesia's achievement is kind of all the more remarkable because these words aren't always phonically sounded out. They do require automated word recognition by sight to be able to pronounce them. So some examples would be food. That is not a phonetically sounding word. You can't sound that word out. It would sound like fud or fod. Some is another word there with that silent E. That is a rule that has to be learnt. When is another one with the silent H here. And then we also have high with that trigraph IGH. That's something that children need to automatically learn there to be able to read those words out loud. So again, this could be further evidence that methods other than systematic phonics programs are being utilised and are indeed supporting children's literacy skills in English in different parts of the world. So from this section of the test then, what are some of the conclusions that we might be able to draw? Whilst we do still need to gather more evidence about children's prior learning and about the way the education system in each country is set up and perhaps differs from each other, we can say that English vocabulary awareness is the strongest of the assessed skills on entry to formal education for this group of children. They can use vocabulary in English to make sense of their world. Understandably, there is a decrease in confidence between their letter and their word recognition at this young age, except of course from the students in Vietnam, which we talked about. Now, this may be that because letter awareness might occur generally through socialization, through their interactions at home. It's unlikely that more formal word recognition training has occurred prior to a student arriving, but that is not impossible if they've been attending EY1 or very prescribed nursery style education. And I think we have some evidence here which is suggesting that those phonics programs where we're sounding out to understand words, and word recognition programs are both working. Children are acquiring literacy skills in English through both methods there. So, final point from me is, I think if we're thinking about what this means for us in our schools, we need to ask ourselves how much English has been spoken around or with the children who are arriving with us. What is it that we can ascertain about their exposure to the language ahead of teaching them? And I'm going to pass back over to Chris now.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you very much. So you can see now how our assessment works. We start off with some very basic concepts and build up from there. And if the child isn't able to answer those questions, we just move on to something else interesting. If they are able to, then we'll give them some more difficult things. And a good example is when we start off on the math side of things with shape recognition, and we'll start off asking children to point to a circle or a star or a square on those 6 items on the left-hand side. And then they may be able to answer those. They may know what a triangle is. They might know what a rectangle is. They might not know what a hexagon is. But if they do get that, then we move over to the right-hand side and we're going to ask them 3D shapes. And that's far more difficult. I mean, we know even with adults that some adults find it difficult to discern 3D shapes from a 2D image. So that in itself is difficult to do. Plus, these things have very specific names. So it's interesting to see exactly what children do know. And of course, a lot of this is, although we put it under the heading of maths, it's also vocabulary as well, because you need the names of these things to be able to point to them and describe them. So if we move to the next slide, you can see here that this is the results of asking children from different schools in different countries what shapes they know. And we can see that the majority of the children in each country were confident in pointing to a circle and to a star, and a little fewer, were capable of recognizing a square and a triangle. Now, once you get down to the more technical names and the things where you have to start counting sides, then things like rectangle and hexagon are known even less. Although we see the same sort of thing as we saw in the literacy side of things, that the children from India seem to be much better at these things than some of the others are. Now, for those who moved on to the 3D shapes, you can see that generally there were fewer children that knew these more technical words, a pyramid, a cylinder, a cube, and a sphere, but you're still talking about maybe 25% of children. And I think a lot of maybe early years teachers might assume that hardly any children know these words, but actually it's quite clear here that even if English isn't their first language, there's still an awful lot of children that know these things. And I think that's something else that we need to remember about all this learning and testing children, is we don't know what they've been taught before. And children at this age are like little sponges. They will pick up this information very quickly. And sometimes they can surprise you in just what they know and what they can do. Even though you might not think that you've taught them those things, they still seem to know them. So it's worth asking, do you know what a pyramid? Can you point to a cylinder? Because as we can see there, an awful lot of children do know those things. So let's move on to the next slide. So we've looked at shapes. The next thing that we have, I think you remember Annie was talking about concepts about print, basic things about, can you point to a full stop and a word and that sort of thing. Well, we have the same idea for maths, which we call ideas about maths. And ideas about maths is really about comparisons. So all mathematics at the very early stage is about comparisons. So we ask them, we have a picture on the left-hand side. We don't show these pictures at the same time, but we start off on the left. And you can say, which of the bugs is on the highest leaf, which one is on the lowest leaf, which one has the most spots, that sort of thing. So they're comparison words, and we need those words to actually describe things within mathematics. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see what the results of that was. And being able to use simple comparison words is fundamental to maths, but with young children, especially if their first language isn't English, it does easily become a vocabulary test. So it's quite surprising then when we look at this that actually the majority of students can point to the smallest bug. They can point to the one with the most spots. They can point to the biggest bug. They can point to the bug on the highest leaf. And it's only when they move to things like the middle or the lowest, and I think a very difficult word for small children, fewest, because we could always also use the word least there, but it's quite a difficult concept. The lowest number, especially if they're not very good at counting, that's quite a difficult thing to do. But again, we can see that there's quite a big variation. The Vietnamese children there do less well, but I don't know whether you remember what I said right at the beginning, but Vietnam is probably our smallest sample and is just represented by one school. So there are fewer pupils there than there are in the samples for the others. And you can also see that India are performing very well on these things. So again, we've seen from what Annie said that they do seem to do very well on vocabulary. And it might be that they're exposed to more English than maybe some of these other children are when they're very young. So let's move on to the next stage. And the next thing we look at is the concept of number. And of course, this is fundamental to learning mathematics. And the first thing that children learn is the names of different numbers. And to start with, what they do is they're just putting a name to a shape in learning letters. But unlike learning letters, they also have to learn that the order of these numbers is important as well. Now, funnily enough, when we started doing these assessments, we started with the number 1 and moved on, but we found that actually children were more familiar with numbers which are around their current age. So we start off now with the number 4 because it tends to be a number that they can recognize slightly more easily than the numbers 1, 2, and so on. So let's have a look and see what children did with the first 10 digits. And I mean, by 10 digits, we included the number 0, which I think is quite a difficult one, but you can see that it doesn't seem difficult to these children. So we're looking at the numbers 1 to 9, and the majority of children in the sample were able to recognize the numbers 0 to 9. The children from Cyprus only really had a strong understanding of the numbers from 1 to 5, which is interesting. Cyprus was a slightly smaller sample, but this is something else that we need to tease out from here. As Annie said, it depends on how they're taught and what they're taught as to whether maybe in Cyprus they spend a bit more time making sure that these children absolutely have a fundamental knowledge of the numbers 1 to 5 before they move them on. Whereas in other countries they carry on and say, okay, we're going to do the numbers up to 10 or up to 9 in this case. So it's difficult to know because there's so much going on in terms of children, schools' philosophy of education and how you educate children in different countries. But there's a clear difference there between the children from Cyprus and the children from the other countries who seem to know the numbers 0 to 9 and have a good, strong understanding of that. Now, if we can move on to the next slide. What we do then for those children that can do the numbers 0 to 9, we then ask them larger numbers. We don't go through all the numbers because that would take too long, but we do take some significant 2-digit numbers and also I think we use the word 100 as well, the number 100, which of course is a 3-digit number. And if we look at the results from that analysis, if we can move on, it's interesting because again, just at the point where children are learning the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, just at the point where it would be nice if it repeated and it was easy to understand, suddenly they have to learn even more words. They have to learn the word 11 and 12 and 13. We don't say 121 and 122 like we do with 21 and 22. And that means that it's a little bit more difficult to learn these things. But you can see here that, again, apart from the children from Cyprus, who are low representation until the point where they peter out at the number 23 on the right hand side. The rest of the children, at least 50% of them in most cases, can recognize the numbers above 10 and can name them. Now, as I said right at the beginning, this assessment is done on a one-to-one basis between an adult and a pupil. And we would hope that the child is saying 19 or 20 or 23, but we have no control over that. We really only have the control of the teacher doing it. And we have heard of some teachers accepting children saying 1-7, which isn't really what we would hope, but that may be the case, that in some cases they're doing that. But learning numbers above 10 requires children to also understand place value. And that's important as well. So in order to recognize things, you need to put together a word that combines both things. So 45, you need to know those two words to make them up. And another thing which we'll come to in a minute when we talk about counting is, of course, we can't count up to numbers that we don't know the words for. So if we don't know the words for numbers above 10, we can't possibly count above 10 because we don't have the vocabulary to use that. And that's something that's often missed. It's often something that people don't think about, is that children wouldn't be able to count above a certain number if they don't know those names for those numbers. So let's move on to the next part of the assessment, and it is indeed counting. And we ask children to count items. On the left-hand side, we ask them to count the number of bugs on a leaf, and on the right-hand side, we ask them to count a number of bugs. And it's quite important. I mean, if anyone's ever heard me speak before, I get quite excited about counting because it combines so many different skills. So when children are counting, they have to do so many different things. They have to know the names of the numbers. They have to know that the numbers appear in a certain order and you can't miss them out or that sort of thing. But most important is they learn something that we technically call the principle of cardinality. And that sounds very posh, but what it means is that when you're counting, the last number you reach is also the number of items that you've just counted. And unless you can understand the principle of cardinality, the fact that once you've stopped counting, the number you said last was also the number of items you counted, you can't really move on from there. The other thing that children can learn, and you can see them do this when they're counting these things, is what's called the order irrelevance principle. And that is, when you're counting things, it doesn't actually matter what order you count them in, but you do need to keep track of which ones you've counted and which ones you haven't. And that again is a skill that young children need to learn. And quite often as teachers, we look at these children and we see them counting the same thing again because they don't know what they've counted and they don't know what they haven't counted. And that's kind of difficult as well. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to talk about in early counting, and this is something that adults do as well, is something called subitizing. And that is when you actually look at a pattern of dots, you can look at the pattern of dots on any of those bugs. As an adult, you didn't count them. you knew that there were 2 on the bugs on the left-hand side and there were 4 on the bugs on the right-hand side. And that's because with small numbers or patterns of dots, you just recognize the pattern. And as I say, that's called subitizing. You see it on dice, you see it on dominoes. And if you can achieve that, then it speeds things up. You don't have to count things. You can just say, oh, I know there's 2 there and 2 there. And if you've got that, then you could simply add them together. Now, it's easy to say simply add them together, but of course, that's another skill as well. So for young children, it's not as simple as that, but certainly they might start to sabotage and you might see that. You might go, well, hang on, they know that number, but I didn't see them counting them, and that's why. So let's move on to see what the results were for counting. And we can see here the ability to count items up to 8 was very strong amongst all the children in the study, which isn't really surprising when we think back to the words they knew. Most children knew the digits 0 to 9. Counting digits using 2-digit numbers tails off in all groups because they may know the words, but they don't necessarily have the ability to count, particularly remembering what things they've counted and what they haven't. And of course, they need the vocabulary in order to name these larger numbers. And again, the children from Cyprus show the greatest drop-off in this area. But as we remember, they also showed the least confidence in naming numbers above 10. So the sample from Vietnam and Thailand, so Vietnam's in the pink and Thailand is in the blue. The sample size of them was similar to that of Vietnam, but we don't see the drop off there. So it's quite kind of interesting to see that they're still fairly strong. But for all children, once you got to 35, that seemed to be about the limit. And let's face it, with 4-year-olds, that's pretty good going to be able to count to 35, 20 or 14. That's really impressive counting because it's a difficult thing to do. So as Annie said, there are a lot of sections to our assessments that these children wouldn't see. There will be other things as well, more difficult mathematics. We would do addition, we would do division, that sort of thing, but only if children were able to show that they could do these things. And it's quite unusual for children at the start of the year when they're 4 years old to be able to do these things. So those are the things that we covered for the mathematics, although there are other things to do. So if we move on to the next slide, just to summarize what we've seen. So as the data clearly show, young children do know a lot about maths and maths concepts when they start in EY2. And that can be quite surprising because parents tend to teach their children less about maths than they do about reading to them or learning words. We've seen that the majority can recognize the first 9 numbers and can count small groups of objects. They generally have good shape recognition skills, and a lot of them are developing their knowledge of 3-dimensional shapes too, which have very specific names, and that's quite a surprise. It was a surprise to me. Many children can do far more than this, and there's a big variation between the achievements of different countries, and that's an important thing to realize. So just to bring this to a close then, if we move to the next slide, it is really interesting to compare different countries with each other, and it's something that we get asked a lot. Well, how do we compare with other countries? How do we compare with other areas of the world? And it is interesting. You can see the data there. You can read the papers if you want to get more information. But there are some general things we also need to bear in mind. So countries vary massively by their provision of education. They vary massively by the age of entry to education. So some children start very young and some children are kept back until they're a little bit older. That can make a huge difference to what we see on these assessments. There are very big social norms around expectation. So in some areas, in some cultures, we know that teachers spend more time on these assessments because they want their children to get them right. And in other situations, they don't do that. So there's a lot of norms about expectation. There's a lot in terms of the philosophy of the importance of education. Some areas of the world value education far more than others. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, the sample sizes were very different and they may not represent the country as a whole. So as I said, we've got one school from Cyprus. We don't really know whether the data from that school could be used as a proxy for the whole of the schools in Cyprus. It would probably be foolish to think that that was the case. So with these preliminary bits of investigation, it's useful to do it, but we shouldn't draw too many conclusions with small samples and the fact that so many different things are going on. And also there's a big, it's sort of like difficult to know what's down to the education system and what's down to what children do in terms of being taught by their parents or using social media or other things to learn these things as well. So it's a bit of a mishmash in terms of when children start in school as to where they learn these things from. But I think it's also very, very interesting. So let's move on to our last slide. And just to summarize, why would you use a baseline assessment at all? Well, the information that Check Together provides is really valuable information for teachers of these children. They come into your class, you won't know very much about them. When they're very young, they learn very quickly. So even if you think you know what they knew a year ago, then it's going to be very different now. Using this information could allow teachers to group children with similar abilities in specific areas and target teaching to their needs. So in England, for instance, it's quite common to have what they call table groups, where you sit children of similar ability together so they could work together, and it's kind of easier for the teacher to keep track of what each group of children is doing. And then the way you would do that is, instead of preparing a general lesson about number recognition, you can target teaching far more precisely to the needs of that group of children. So you can have different children in the room doing different things depending on their needs, and you would know what their needs were because you could tell what they know and can do, and you've asked them and you can see the results. So that sort of summarizes what we're talking about now, so we can move on to the last slide and we can leave ourselves open to any questions that might have appeared in the chat or any questions that anyone has that they'd like to ask now.
Thank you, Chris and Annie. That was a really, really useful presentation, really insightful. We do have quite a few questions, so if I think we do have some time left, we can ask them. Okay, so could you please clarify during the presentation the data that you've shown? Is this just for the start of year assessments, or does it include end of year data as well?
This was just start of year. We didn't want to complicate things by looking at end of year. And I think it's a specific case, as I said, where, you've got children coming into school, some of whom haven't been to school before. So this is where you get the greatest variation. So this was start of year only. Yeah, in theory, we could do another analysis where we looked at what children know at the end of year. And we could even do an analysis where we look at relative progress from country to country. But I'm not sure whether that would be a good idea, but it would be interesting.
Absolutely, and that makes it even more surprising. Some of those results, what children already know and can do, like you say, they're just sponges at that age, picking everything up.
Yeah.
And could you clarify again what age range generally were the children that did the assessments for this bit of research?
The majority of children doing this were between 4 and 5 years old. There were some outliers. I do know that there was at least one 6-year-old, but there weren't many of those. And I'm pretty sure there weren't any children younger than 4 or 5. So most of them were 4 or 5 years old.
Thank you very much. Okay, and why were the assessments done primarily? Was the research the focus of these assessments, or was it a different reason?
Um, well, in Cambridge Insight, we've had a history of doing baseline assessment. We've done baseline assessment in England for at least 20 years, and that's been very useful for teachers in England. We've developed baseline assessments for other areas, for Scotland, for Wales, that sort of thing. And then other schools in other areas of the country, particularly if they were trying to offer an English type education, were asking for that sort of thing as well. So we've developed baseline assessments for um, schools all over the world, really. But the reason we developed the Check Together assessment is because it was developed as part of the new Cambridge Early Years curriculum, which came into being about 2 years ago. And that's largely a play-based curriculum, but they did want to include a baseline assessment, and so they asked us to produce a baseline assessment to be implemented as part of the Cambridge Early Years curriculum.
Thank you. Okay, if you just had a message to say that that someone has a question, that's great. Could you please type your questions into the chat box, and I'll ask the presenters. Okay. So the big question, I think, that's just come through is, how does all of this, how can we use it to help children in the future? What can teachers actually do with this insight?
Um,
Do you want?
I think that what this is really offering you is an indication of what your children can do at the start. And really, if we think about what education is, it's about adding value, isn't it? It's about taking a child from a starting point and moving them towards an end point. Now, whatever that end point is, that's debatable depending on, what your priorities are, what your education system is asking for. But what this is really showing you is where to start. It's a false economy to just throw all children into the same learning space and expect the same outcomes when they're all starting at very different places. We have to meet them where they are, and then we have to support them on their way to whatever end goal we are putting in place. And this allows you to do that. So if you do have children who are demonstrating, real confidence with their 3D shapes and their vocabulary, but then conversely you have some children who are really stuck with that, who aren't really able to move past the first 5 numbers, or who have, some very basic tier 1 vocabulary in English, but don't have much more than that. You're going to have to do different things for those children to get them to the same end. And that's really what any baseline is showing you. But particularly in the early years, that's so fundamental, because what we do here, particularly around learning and how we inspire them to learn and how we support them to learn, is going to kind of have an impact on their entire educational journey. So it's a really crucial moment to understand what they can do.
Absolutely. And kind of just on that, because we've said that this the check together is taken at the beginning of EY2. So if teachers that have got children in EY1, they only need to start capital or small letters into EY2. The curriculum is maybe slightly not quite matching up. So I think we've created a bit of worry that teachers aren't doing what they need to in EY1. Can we just reassure them that that's not the case at all?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that, Chris, as you developed it with the early years curriculum, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, in some of our previous baseline assessments, we have used a mixture of capital letters and lowercase letters, and a lot of teachers have said to us, "Well, we only start with lowercase letters." And I mean, I can sort of understand that, but my argument is, if a child is reading and learning to read, the very first letter they're going to see is likely to be a capital, because it'll be the start of a sentence. So we can't completely ignore that, and they'll see capital letters at the beginning of people's names and any proper nouns, that sort of thing. So we can't ignore that, but I can understand that you don't want to go all in and do everything, because these are very different shapes, and it's like learning numbers, there's a lot to go on. And I think that's okay, you know. It might be that you have, I mean, back to what Annie said, if you've got a child that knows all their lowercase letters, and then you in a class, you say, right, we're going to learn the letter T. And what we don't want to do is we don't want small children of 4 years old to get bored in school right at the beginning because they're covering stuff they already know. What would be nice is you say, okay, these children really have a concrete understanding of their letters. Let's take them to one side and teach them some new stuff. Let's teach them some capital letters, maybe even move forward with those and start with what Annie was talking about, some blends of letters and get some new sounds and things that they don't know about, rather than treating everyone the same and assuming that they're empty vessels and we've got to fill them with all this knowledge. What we have to understand is that they're not empty vessels, and we have to find out what they know and can do. And I think the important thing from this international study is often it's their understanding of English that will hold them back. So they might be very good at number, but anything that needs English vocabulary could be problematic. So we need to bear that in mind as well as teachers, that they might be held back, and those are areas that they might need to be concentrating on a bit more.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I've noticed we've just run out of time. So if you have put a question in that we haven't got around to answering, we will try and get back to you later on this week. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Annie and Chris, for sharing that really interesting research. It is such an important time of education and in people's lives, and there's so many questions involved. So I'm really excited to see what we can do next, and thank you for sharing. Like I said, you will receive a certificate of attendance. For joining, please keep an eye out on your inbox. It might come through your junk mail. I apologise if you need to go searching for it, but if you do have any more questions or need to get in touch, please contact us, insight@cambridge.org, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye.